take you on a wonderful journey. Petra, the rose-red city, half as old as time. Those words were immortalized by Dean Burgin in his prize poem of 1845. Now, few sights have captured our imagination or excited our sense of wonder as much as this ancient Nabatean city in southwestern Jordan. From the first time I heard of these fabulous ruins, I had a deep desire to visit what is called to be, or purported to be, the most fantastic ruins on earth. And so in 1986, I made my first journey over there to Petra and began exploring. I didn't have any gray hair in those days and didn't have bad knees, and I was just amazed to see these thousands of temples and tombs and homes carved into the rock there in the desert of southwestern Jordan. Now, its original name was Selah, which is a Semitic word that means rock. Later on, it got the name Petra, which is the Greek word for rock, so it means the same thing, rock. And you can kind of see why, right? It's just all rocky. Now, this is very interesting. As I went the first time, flew into Amman, Jordan, and we took the desert highway. And that's about 3 hours from the airport in Amman down to Petra if you take the desert highway, which we're on right now. And we found these cars that were bound with goods from the only seaport in Jordan called Aqaba. And this car was actually bound for Kuwait. It's loaded with so many goods you think the car might just tip over. And occasionally you find some more interesting cargo as you travel around the land. Probably a common sight around here, right? But anyway, it was wonderful to go and visit that. Now today I try and take the King's Highway. King's Highway adds about 8 hours to your trip, but look what you're going down. And by the way, the King's Highway is actually mentioned in the Bible. Please let us pass through your country. We will not go through any field or vineyard or drink water from any well. We will travel along the King's Highway and not turn to the right or to the left until we pass through your territory. The children of Israel are asking the Edomites and the Moabites and the Ammonites, let us go through your road, the King's Way. And they said, no, you can't do that. So I like to go that way, and this is actually called the Grand Canyon of Jordan. It's called the Wadi Arnon, or the Arnon Gorge, also mentioned in the Bible. Now, my first trip, back in 1986, there were hardly any hotels. There was not very much infrastructure in Petra. So we stopped here at this little site. This is called the Spring of Moses. So local tradition says that Moses hit that rock where this little boy is kind of bending down and struck the rock, and water flowed out, and this water then flows, called the Wadi Musa, or the Stream of Musa. It's a dry riverbed in the summer. The Stream of Musa, and it goes right through the city. And they said this was Moses' spring. So it's called the Spring of Moses, Ein Musa. And so Bible says that the Edomites didn't really let them go through there, so they probably didn't pass through Petra, although Josephus believes Petra, by the way, is Kadesh. Interesting, Kadesh Barnea. I don't believe that personally, but that's what he believed. But they had to go around the area, so they probably didn't come through Petra itself, but they were close. Well, the hotelier had a little pension there, and he wanted us to try and check out the accommodations, so we went and checked them out. This is my wife's first trip to this part of the world, and so we went in, and she looked at the bedroom, and she looked at the bathroom, and the bathroom had a Turkish toilet. Now, do you know what a Turkish toilet is? Yeah, it's just it's a piece of porcelain with some footholes and a hole in the middle, and that's where you do your business. But this hotel not only had a Turkish toilet, it had the shower directly above the Turkish toilet. So you stay in the toilet to take the shower, and she said, I can't take this, you got to take me somewhere else. So we left. I went back and visited that a few years ago, by the way, and chatted with the guy and had a good laugh about it. So we went over to the government rest house. Now, in those days, there were only like 2 or 3 places in Petra. Today, there's hundreds of hotels because it's one of the most visited places on earth. We went over to the government rest house, which now is actually been transformed into the Holiday Inn. I'll think of the name of it in a moment. So I try and use that for my hotel because it's actually inside the site. Now, off in the distance, you can see this mountain peak. It's called Mount Hor. Can you see the little white building on the top? This is where tradition says that Aaron, the brother of Moses, was buried. Now, it's very interesting. I'm just filming right now a series on the Exodus, and so we use this shot on the one side. And when you're down in the Araba on the other side, you can look up and see the same white building, right? So it's just a little tiny ridge there. And so my wife and I were up very early. We wanted to see that, but we wanted to go down and see those ruins purported to be the most spectacular upon the earth. Isn't that something? Yeah, I have not taken the time to hike over there, but one day I got to do it. I'm usually there on my tours for 2 nights and 1 full day, and then we're on to the next place. This is an interesting one called Il-Birai, and it's mother of cisterns. And what's interesting about it is it's a rock, flat, with hundreds of cisterns carved into the rock. It's also known as Mount Seir. Mount Seir, another name for Esau. So this is where the Edomites were living. And you can imagine if you're up on top of that and you had water and food, you could hold off any size army, right? Because they learned a long time ago in this part of the world that it's easier to throw rocks down than it is to throw rocks up, right? And so it was very interesting. Well, the Bible actually talks about Mount Seir and the people who dwell there. It says in Jeremiah 49, verse 16, "You who live in the clefts of the rocks, who occupy the heights of the hill, though you build your nest as high as the eagles, from there I will bring you down, declares the Lord." So here's a prophecy from Jeremiah about that very rock and how you're living up there in your pride and your arrogance, but I'm going to bring you down from that because of your arrogance. And guess what? The Edomites are no more. They cease to exist. Now, the Edomites were here first, and then later on they were replaced by the Nabateans who built the ruins that we're going to investigate tonight. Well, instead of going back into town, my wife and I had gone out early at sunrise to catch that. We didn't go back into town and catch the horses like most people do, so I talked her into scaling down the cliffs, and there's my good-looking wife back in 1987, and we're climbing down these cliffs, and we're depositing blood as we're scraping our bodies with shorts, and it only adds to the anticipation of seeing the most spectacular ruins on earth, as we're about to notice. So entrance into the city is obtained through a few narrow rock gorges called wadis. A wadi is a dry riverbed that flows only when the rains come. So over the millenniums, the rains have carved these channels to the sandstone mountains. They go on for about 8,000 feet, 1.5 miles. Now, it doesn't rain very often there, but during the wintertime, about 12 inches of rain fall, and it all falls at once, so it tends to be flash floods. So you can see how interesting it is to go through these long gorges. Here you can actually see that when I first was there, you couldn't see what's on the right. On the right is actually an aqueduct on both sides where they're taking water into the city because every drop of water was precious. This was like the Las Vegas of the ancient world, right? And so now they've actually come down about 10 feet, excavating down to the base. So now we're down, actually you can walk on the Roman stones. So the Edomites were there, and then they're replaced by the Arab Nabateans, and then the Romans come and occupy the site after that. So you can see from up on the high place how that a city that is hidden in the mountains like this, and there's only a few places that you can come in from a couple of different valleys that you could just have a few hundred soldiers and keep thousands of enemies at bay. So it was well protected, well defended, and here we go. This is one of the most beautiful things you'll ever see. As you come down, most of the places are about 20 feet wide. You come to a little opening just 9 feet wide, and there before you opens up the incredible rock-cut Pharaohs Treasury of Petra. Isn't that beautiful? Now, there's no great significance to this archaeologically, but for the lover of art, I don't think there's anything more beautiful than what we just saw there. And so we can look at those lines, the 90-foot columns, the Corinthian columns, over 90 feet high. It's called El Kesna, which means Pharaoh's Treasury, but really not a treasury at all. It's now we know it's not a treasury. We know it was a monument for a tomb. A monument for a tomb. So it was hidden away from the wind and the rain. It was good solid rock, and so it's endured all of these years. Now I want you to keep this picture in your memory because you can see the stairs going up into the door, correct? I'm going to show you a picture in a few moments where you don't see that, where you see where the debris was when it was first found. Now, this incredible place was lost to the west for over 1,000 years. Over 1,000 years. So we can, again, take another look at the beautiful treasury, Kesna El Pharaoh, or Pharaoh's Treasury. And so here you can see people. Now, this is back in 1987. You can see people coming out. They were actually going into the room. Now, Have you seen that room in a movie? What was the name of the movie? Indiana Jones and the Holy Grail, right? So he's looking for the Holy Grail, and he comes into here, and he goes into that room, and it's a big labyrinth of all kinds of stuff in there, and it's just it's not as big as this room for sure. It's maybe a fourth of this room, of this sanctuary that we're sitting in tonight, just like a closet, nothing there at all. But it was certainly a big imagination in Indiana Jones and the Holy Grail. But if you can see where the lady's walking with the burqa on there, there's something interesting that's happened there now. They've actually started digging here, and they found that this was actually a monument for the tomb of King Aretas IV. King Aretas IV, who is he? He's the guy that had Paul locked in the city of Damascus. All right? Very interesting. So we can actually look down and we can see his tomb. So that's where grade was back in Paul's day, about 20 or 30 feet below where we're looking at right now. So as time has come and all the rain has come and all the sand and the dirt is washed down, the elevation has just risen up through the years. Kind of interesting. So here's a picture of David Roberts, who went through shortly after this was discovered. And look at that. Can you see where people are way, the whole grade is way up high, going right into the door, right? And so they've had to excavate all that down to that lower level. Same thing when I was telling you about I didn't really see any of those aqueducts and so on going down through the Sikh in the past, but there it is. Well, let's take one look back to the Sikh. You can just see that little 9-foot opening there. Very beautiful, very wonderful. It means cleft. And so now we're going to wander on through the ruins of Petra, because there's over 1,000 temples, tombs, homes, dwellings that were carved into the solid rock. Some have eroded with time, like this one. You can kind of see this is not very preserved, not very nice. Kind of looks like the treasury. It's actually called the Corinthian tomb, but it's kind of worn down. You can see just everywhere. It kind of depends on how exposed it's been to the rain and then the type of stone that was used. Here's the urn tomb. Now, the urn tomb is kind of interesting because it was actually a church. They found it was a Greek Orthodox church. There's a Greek Orthodox symbol painted in the back. So back in the Byzantine times, 6th century, it was actually used as a church. So quite interesting. There's that Corinthian tomb. And you can see that one, how disfigured it is, because it looks like the treasury, but it's actually just kind of worn down because it's exposed to the wind. Now, when you climb way over on the other side, at the end of the valley, and you go up, you come to this. Now, this fabulous building was not created by carving it into the mountain, but removing the mountain. Can you see that? They actually removed the mountain. It's called Ed-Dir, or the monastery. And there's about 1,000 steps to get up there to the top of it. It's quite imposing to go up there and quite wonderful. I usually make that journey a couple times a year. And there you can just see all the detail of this. You can see the door. The door is cut. It's about 30 feet high, as if it was to be used by a race of giants. And so this was one of the most sacred places in Petra. And in the old days, the brave or foolish, depending on your definition, we could actually go up on the top, and we could go out and look out and kind of see across to the Wadi Araba over on the other side of the mountains. Today, it's very difficult to get up there. They've tried to close it. About 2 years ago, in 2019, I had a group of pastors, and we got caught in a flash flood. Now, a number of years ago, I think it was 20 French tourists were killed from a flash flood. My wife was certain, I'm going to run that again, my wife was certain that we were going to be killed. And I want to just tell you that the locals were running down saying, "Run for your lives." And I'm thinking, why would you run down? If the water's all going down at the bottom, you want to run up, not run down. And my wife said, "We have to go." And I had a group of pastors there. You can maybe see them hiding over here on the right. We found a little refuge on that, and I found an escape chute behind us. And so everybody was kind of settling down after the rains finally stopped. And of course, I'm hoping that it's not going to keep rising. It only rose about 6 inches on us. Petra has this wonderful veins of color from the various minerals. You can see them here. It's just spectacular to see how the reds and blues, and look at that, the yellows. It's just wonderful seeing how they made their home in this site. Now, when the Romans came, they built this amphitheater. It'll seat about 2,500 people. This amphitheater with acoustics so wonderful you don't have to have a microphone. And so it's the Roman period was very great. Now, right next to the amphitheater, you have the stairs that go up to the high place. And this is a very beautiful hike and very wonderful hike to go up to. And as you go up to the top, you come to the high place where there was a place of ritual sacrifice. And we know that they sacrificed animals here, and many people believe they sacrificed humans as well. You can see where the blood would go down into the hole and then would drain out. And they had a very elaborate temple almost there on the very top in the high place. So Petra, fabulous place, well watered, yet it was deserted and forgotten for over 1,000 years. Many people thought it was just a legendary city, perhaps like Atlantis. Did it really exist? We really didn't know because no one had seen it for over 1,000 years. What happened? Well, the people weren't sure if these stories told about it were true and how much had to be discarded. They didn't know until 1812. There was a Swiss gentleman, John Louis Burkhardt, and he was traveling from Damascus to Cairo back in 1812. He spoke Arabic, he learned Arabic, he dressed as an Arab, he kind of lived like a Muslim. He's trying to travel through, and as he's going through the land, he starts hearing about some extraordinary ruins in the Wadi Musa, and he says, I have a great desire to visit these ruins. So here's from his diary. He says, the road from Shobak to Aqaba, which is tolerably good, lies to the east of Wadi Musa, and to have quitted it out of mere curiosity to see the wadi would have looked suspicious in the eyes of the Arabs. I therefore pretended to have made a vow to have slaughtered a goat in honor of Aaron, whose tomb I knew was situated at the extremity of the valley. And by this strategy I thought that I should have the means of seeing the valley on my way to the tomb. To this my guide had nothing to oppose. The dread of drawing on himself by resistance the wrath of Aaron completely silenced him. You get the picture? Over 1,000 years, nobody from the West has seen it. They don't know if it's real or not. Were the Greeks and Romans just exaggerating about what they had seen? Nobody knew. And now as he's going through, he starts hearing about this, and he says, well, I heard it was there. When he comes to the village of Elgi, he finds someone to help him. He wants someone to take him out so he can slaughter a goat to Aaron. And just like we saw the tomb on the top of that mountain, you can see the tomb out there. And so he wants to go and get closer to it to sacrifice that, but he really wants to see, is this Petra? Is this ancient site? And so he finds somebody to help him with the goat and the water skin, and they start traveling. And he comes in, and he's the first person from the West for over 1,000 years to see that site. Can you imagine? He goes over and he starts sketching it. He sketches that. He sketches the Corinthian tomb, the Roman tomb, and then the guy says, you're just a treasure hunter, and pulls his rifle out on him like that, and he's okay. So he goes over and he sacrifices his goat to Aaron, and then he leaves the valley. And this is what he says in his diary. It appears very probable that the ruins in Wadi Musa are those of ancient Petra. And it is remarkable that Eusebius wrote a tremendous series of books called the Ante and Post-Nicene Fathers. So if you think about Nicene, Nicaea, the Nicene Creed, and before the Nicene Creed and after the Nicene Creed, he writes this. He's like the personal pastor, you might say, of Constantine. He writes this series of books, right? That Eusebius says the tomb of Aaron was shown near Petra. And so he's now able to verify it. How incredible is that? So we ask the question, how could something as fantastic as this city cut into the rock of southwestern Jordan be forgotten for 1,000 years? How could something as important as this be forgotten? Now, as I said earlier, this was the kingdom of Edom, and you can kind of see the territory of Edom, the Edomites, okay? And so, by the way, Herod the Great is half Edomite and half Jewish. It's also called the Idumeans, okay? So you can see Petra is kind of there. You can see a little place above it called Basra. That was the capital of the Edomites, all the way down to Ezion Gibor, which is going to be Elat and Aqaba, right? In all that area. So they were actually maintaining the highway. Can you see the King's Highway there? The King's Highway is going through their territory. So they're maintaining that part of the highway. And so these guys were kind of ruthless at one point. The caravans were coming through, and they were raiding the caravans. Then they got a better idea. Why raid them? Why don't we charge a toll. Why don't we service them? Now, any idea how many camels are in a caravan? 8? Take a guess. Take another guess. More? 80? Take another guess. Usually 1,000, and often there's 10 caravans hooked together, so there's 10,000. These are the ancient merchant ships of the ancient world. Now, can you imagine having 1,000 camels roll into your place, and you got to service them, right? So these guys make incredible amounts of money, not by raiding them, not by terrorizing them, but by protecting them and selling them food. And so actually, when you go into Petra, it's fascinating. They didn't bring the camels into Petra, but the camel operators, the people in charge, the chiefs, they would go into Petra, and they would have all their various gods from whatever part of the world they came from, and they'd come in, they'd pay their incense and burn their incense to thank their gods for a safe journey and so on. And then carved in, I should put that picture up, you can actually see, they've actually carved camels and people leading camels on the walls along Petra. Very fascinating, because this is what it was all about. So it was a caravan route up the King's Way, and they made incredible amounts of money. Well, what were they taking? Well, they're taking all this wonderful stuff, frankincense, myrrh. So this stuff is more valuable than gold, sometimes costing 10 times by ounce more than gold. And they're transporting this, and so it becomes extremely rich from all of this. And so we wonder what happened. They're making all this money that they could carve all these buildings and become the Las Vegas of the ancient world. What in the world happened? By the way, they captured all that water, they diverted water, they saved water. Wonderful engineering. There's actually a wonderful piece on Nova. If you Google it, you can watch it online. And you can see they actually call it the Las Vegas of the ancient world, what they did with the water out in the desert and how they captured the water and brought it in, had swimming pools and gardens and just much like Las Vegas out in the middle of the desert. Well, what happened? Well, the trade routes changed. And then you can kind of see here, can you see the Red Sea over here? I'm sorry, my little pointer doesn't work on that screen. But we can kind of see the Red Sea over here. Oh, maybe it does. No, it doesn't. Maybe it's my pointer. Anyway, you can see the Red Sea up there. And if you go to the right arm of the Red Sea, that's the Gulf of Aqaba. That's where they would go, and they go up to the dead. You can maybe see that little spot. That's the Dead Sea, and you can go up to Damascus that way. But once they were able to go around Africa sailing, they didn't need to go by camel caravan anymore, so the trade routes changed, the sea lanes opened, and they forgot all about old Petra. Petra goes away and is forgotten. But remember what the Bible has said? This is what the sovereign Lord says about Edom. The pride of your heart has deceived you, you who live in the clefts of the rocks and make your home on the heights, you who say to yourself, who can bring me down to the ground? Though you soar like the eagle and make your nest among the stars, from there I will bring you down, declares the Lord. There will be no survivors from the house of Esau, the Lord has spoken. And so we find the words of Obadiah, like the words of Jeremiah, met a marked fulfillment in that the people of Edom are no more. They come to an end. And that's exactly what happened. So the prophets predicted the fall, and history shows how that it happened. It shows the fulfillment because the Edomites passed away. Petra was actually forgotten for over 1,000 years and then rediscovered by the inquiry of travelers and the archaeologists. Now, I want to talk to you a little bit about archaeology. That brings me to archaeology. Archaeology is an interesting science. It's not a science of geology. It's a relatively new science. It's not geology, the study of the rocks, or anthropology, the study of man. But it's actually the study of the remains, the artifacts, what's left behind of human habitation. And so on the sites we find things like this. Now you've heard me say that most of these things are found in tombs like this. This is actually what we find on the archaeological site. Broken pieces of pottery. They're called potsherds or pot shards. Sometimes that's a rim. Can you see that's a rim of a pot? And here's a handle of a pot. Sometimes I write down where I pick these up. This one happened to come from Smyrna. This one happened to come from a place called Gilgal. And over here, can you see what this is? This is like a napkin holder, right? But really it's the handle of a pot, right? It's the handle of a pot. The pot gets broken. This big piece doesn't disintegrate quite as quickly and go back to the earth, and so it stays there, and it's the handle of a pot. That one happens to be from a place called Tel Dor, a very early coastal city in ancient Israel and Canaan. And so we look at how archaeology works, and so we look at the remains of that. So I want to talk to you a little bit about archaeology. Now, when we think about archaeology in the Bible lands, we have to think about Helena. Remember who Helena was? The mother of Constantine. She becomes a Christian, and so she goes to the Holy Land because she wants to seek out the places where the stories happen. She wants to find out, where was Calvary? Where was Jesus born? So she actually will go there and she'll build a church in Bethlehem, where she was pointed that Jesus was born. She'll build a church in Jerusalem, where she was pointed that Jesus was crucified. She'll build a church up on the Mount of Olives, where she was pointed that Jesus had given the prophecy about the destruction of Jerusalem. She builds these churches. So people began coming after Helena to these churches because they felt they could make a pilgrimage and they could receive salvation. Now, I don't believe that, but that's what people believe. They believe they could go there and receive salvation. Now, this is an interesting picture. This is actually in the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. Can you see there's a Greek Orthodox priest standing on the right, on the left, I should say on your left. He's a Greek Orthodox priest because they're kind of the big guys. They're in charge. There's 6 different religions that maintain the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. We'll talk a little bit about this tomorrow night. So you have the Greek Orthodox and the Roman Catholic. They come during the Crusades in the 10th and 11th centuries, 12th centuries. They're not there before that. But then you got this guy who's kneeling there. Can you see him? He's got a funny hat. He's got a pointed hat. You know who he is? He's an Armenian, because that's the first Christian nation, and that's Mount Ararat. And so there are very big players in Jerusalem. There's actually a quarter tomorrow night we'll see called the Armenian Quarter. And so they're having the Armenian Mass, but the Greek Orthodox is watching over to make sure nothing's done inappropriately while they're there. People even come today, this is the stone of unction, and they will touch things there because they think that it has healing powers. But this kind of goes out of vogue. People kind of come to the conclusion that you don't get salvation by going somewhere. And so it kind of falls into disuse, you might say. But with the coming of the Reformation, they began reading their Bibles and singing about places like the Sea of Galilee and the Jordan River. And people began to wonder, well, what's it like? What's there? Makes sense, right? They're reading about this. Well, what's it like? So people start going over to take a look. What's it like? And they come away with a cursory understanding. They go to the Jordan River and they see it's not like even the Kalamazoo River, probably. It's small. It's not the Mississippi for sure. It's a little tiny river, but very important. They go to the Sea of Galilee, lowest freshwater lake on earth, over 700 feet below sea level. Subtropical, but this is where Jesus walked on the water. And so they're kind of amazed as they come. And they come away with a kind of a geographical understanding of the Bible that they're reading. And then we have the Renaissance period. Now, the Renaissance period, they were there just to look for pieces to put in the museums, kind of like the pieces I have here. That's what they were looking for. Things to go into that. So they weren't really trying to excavate anything. They were just looking what they could come back and sell in Europe. And we can kind of see some of the things. We'll actually have some Roman glass out tomorrow night like that. And then when Napoleon went down into Egypt, like we talked about last night, and they were able, Napoleon broke into the world of Pharaonic writing, all of a sudden they began to wonder about all these different things, and interest began to be fueled in the ancient world. And then they found the Rosetta Stone, as I said, and it all began to open up. Well, Edward Robinson came down in 1850, and he's here at the Spring of Jericho. This is the Spring of Jericho. And I find this fascinating because he says, I'm here at the Spring of Jericho, but I have no idea where the ancient city was. Now, in this picture, where I'm standing, the Spring of Jericho is between me and the hill that you see there, the Tell. That's Tell Jericho. You could throw a stone from where he was standing and hit the hill, but he didn't know it was under the hill. They just didn't understand how all this worked. Now, look at that. Jericho, not a very big city, by the way, about 6 acres, 7 acres, very small, about 1,000 people, but a very powerful city in the ancient world. They came here to the tomb and excavated this tomb on the Mount of Olives. That's actually a misnomer because they were really just looking for artifacts. They were finding what these are called ossuaries, bone boxes, and so they're looking for those bone boxes to see what they might could find to take back and sell in Europe. Well, a man by the name of Sir William Flinders Petrie comes down to Egypt, and he believes that the pyramids The size of the pyramids, the measuring of the pyramids actually reveals the future of the world. Have you ever heard anything like that? He believes it's a prophecy, these sizes and so on. So he comes down to study and measure the pyramids. And while he's there, he starts getting enamored with the ancient world and many of the things they're finding. They had found and taken classical pottery for many years, and they were able to arrange a chronology from Greece and Crete and Cyprus and so on. And they began finding all this unpainted pottery like I have on the table, and then he began wondering, could we make a chronological order in this as well? And so he started focusing on that. Now he was quite moved by this as he's there, and he's able to actually start a dig. In 1890, he comes down here by the coast, Tel El Hesi. A stream bed had cut through this tell, and it exposed. Can you see let me see if I can go back to that picture. You see like the stones, and you see these broken pieces of pottery there, and so on. And so he sees all this, and so he starts digging in this open area. Here you can actually see a place where it's been burned. Can you see the little dark area? You can see an ash layer where somebody had come and burned their city. And so he started digging there, and they're getting this little cursory understanding of archaeology. This is how it all starts, to be honest. And then we can kind of see something interesting happens. Got to go back to that one. I went too far. We see what develops as two important things. The first is that there's sequence dating, and so we can actually date some of these things in sequence. The next thing is stratigraphy, that there's strata, that the people who were there first lived on the bottom, and then another group of people came and lived above them, and so on. This is all the basic things of archaeology. So the humble potsherd, the rubbish on the ground of any excavated site, was elevated to become the major implement in the archaeologist's hand in his attempts to pry open the vault of time. What a great quote that is from Biblical Archaeology in Focus. So here we have it, sequence dating. That is, these lamps are in sequence. Pottery is in sequence. They're learning and growing. Some of you have been to the table, and we look at some of these lamps that roll around, and then we come to this lamp right here, and it's got a nice little pedestal base on the bottom of it. If you find that, you know it should be from that period, right? So they didn't have this way back in this other. So as they find these things, it helps them to be able to identify where they are in this multi-layered cake, you might say. And that's that stratigraphy. There's a multi-layered cake with a stratigraphy. So there's a strata, and so what would happen is people were living there, and then maybe a warlord comes and attacks them and knocks their buildings down and takes the children off somewhere else and kills the women, or takes the women and the children, kills the men. The children remember the place, so they come back and they live there. They flatten it out, right? Build again, and so they start building on the same place time after time after time. So I wonder about why would they do that? Well, Pierre Vincent becomes an expert in pottery typology, and we can actually see the lamps, much like we have on the table here. We're laying out from the time of Abraham all the way down to the early church. They're doing the same thing, and this becomes the basis of it. Sometimes, when you're on a site, they would actually find a broken piece of pottery like this, and they'd actually find writing on it. So this writing is called ostraca, or ostracon plural, and it's very interesting. In the ancient Greek world, when they'd have a trial, the jurors would be given a piece of pottery, a potsherd, a piece of ostraca, and they would write guilty or not guilty. If you were guilty, what would it be called? What would you be called? What would happen to you? You would be what? It was ostraca. You'd be ostracized, exactly. That's where the word comes from. And so, why was the site chosen? Why did they keep going back? Well, first, the most important thing to have is water, right? You have to have water. And so, maybe help me real quick. What would be a great source of water for a city? A river? Well, you probably have, I see that Kalamazoo River's by here, right? What else would you want? What would be another source? We saw it in Jericho a minute ago. A spring. That's probably the best, right? If you have a spring, that's really good. What else? Jacob dug one. A well, right? And so we have these sources of water. Well, not everywhere has a great source of water. And the next thing you'd want is defensive walls. As I said, they learn to throw rocks down. It's easier than throwing rocks up. So we have these defensive walls. Look at that one. That's called Tel Bet Shan, about 90 feet high. Look at that. It'd be very hard to attack that. And then on the top, you've got your walls around for defense. And so it was really great. Next thing you need is you can grow stuff, right? You want to have good soil like you have around here. So you can grow stuff. Look at the arable soil. By the way, look at that tell. You can actually see the walls going around the edge of the tell, can't you? Kind of see the water coming by. And so few sites had all of these qualities, so they tended to use the site over and over and over again through the years. So that's where we get this stratification. We just think about it like a multi-layered cake, right? And as you go up higher, these are the people that are closer to us, right? You go down further away from us. So how can you tell it's a tell or a hill? Well, tells tend to be conical in shape. They tend to be round and get narrower at the top. They tend to have visible building remains like we saw there on that one. You can actually see some of the stones sticking out. Often you can see dressed stones. That means stones that have been chiseled and have been used in place versus just a rough, unhewn stone. Ancient traditions, often the very names identify these places. And of course, as you're walking around on a tell, you have this. Now, I lived in New England at one point, and I tried to have a garden. And you know what I grew every spring? Rocks. I had to go out and clean the rocks out of my garden. Where did they come from? They're coming up from the earth. So I have all those beautiful rock walls in Massachusetts and New Hampshire, right? Well, here, the pottery just works its way up. You have a little bit of rain, it just comes up. So as you walk around, you have it. Well, we want to look at meaning from the sands of the past. What can we learn about the Bible as we look into this thing of archaeology? Well, here's a great quote from Archaeology and the Religion of Israel. There can be no doubt that archaeology has confirmed the substantial historicity of the Old Testament tradition. Now, archaeology can't prove the Bible's true, but it can look and see if it's historically accurate, right? I think about this place in Mesopotamia called Nuzi, and they found some cuneiform tablets, and we got a cuneiform tablet you should take a picture of if you're taking pictures of our stuff tonight that's on the table. And this one happened to sit on the screen, happened to talk about the rights of a barren woman. The woman couldn't produce children for her husband. She had the right to go and choose a surrogate for her husband to have a child with. Who had the right? The wife. What does that sound like? Sarah, Hagar, Abraham, following the customs of their day. There's another one they found. I hadn't talked about a guy selling his birthright for 3 sheep. What does that sound like? Esau selling his birthright for a bowl of pottage to his brother Esau, right? Esau selling his birthright to Jacob, I should say, for a bowl of lentils. And so these stories that seem so odd to us are actually confirmed by many of these clay tablets. So over and over again, we can see that stories we thought were myth are actually affirmed. Now, in 1987, I went to Tel Mardik. Tel Mardik would have been in the news, and I wanted to go there. It's known popularly as Ebla, about 150 acres in size. Jericho was 7 to 10 acres in size. 150 acres, so at least 15 to 20 times the size of Jericho, right? So the Italians just started digging there in 1964. They didn't find much. Then they found the royal palace. In 1976, they found 1,000 tablets here, where I'm standing in this little room, 1,000 tablets. Can you imagine? The guy was so excited because here was a whole language they didn't know about, right? And they found these tablets, and then they began to find the throne room, the archives where I was standing, and when they came and were conquered, the fires of the Akkadians just kind of burned them and just made them hard, and there they were. Ultimately, they find over 20,000 clay tablets here in Ebla. Now, Abraham would have stopped here on his way to the land of promise. So I wanted to go there and see this, right? I wanted to go and see this. Now, in 2350 BC, 30,000 people lived inside the city walls. Jericho, 1,000 people. So 30 times the size of Jericho. More than 300,000 people living in the whole area around it. And it was a fantastic. So they found trade records. Now, this is kind of pre-Abraham, right? And so they found trade records with Hatzor. Hatzor is mentioned in the Bible because Joshua conquers it. Interesting. Lachish, Megiddo, Gaza, and then they found Salem. And if you follow along what the Bible says about Jerusalem, it's not called Jerusalem in the book of Genesis, it's called Salem. Means peace, the city of peace, right? Jerusalem means city of peace. That's what it was called, just like it was in the Bible. So in 1977, Professor Peyton Nadeau, he startled the world by saying he found bills of sale to Sodom and Gomorrah. Now, I have to tell you, this is controversial, This is what he said, and he was the linguist in charge of the archaeological dig. Keep that in the back of your mind for a moment. He found names like paralleled Abraham, Ishmael, Israel, Esau, Eber, just like they're in the Bible. And so as he saw this coming, he published this, and it became very, very controversial. Very, very controversial. I had a group of, it doesn't matter anymore, I'll say it. I had a group of pastors I had on tour, and I took them to Greece, Turkey, and Syria. And we were in Syria, and I kept telling them, I said, my young tour guide, we need to go to Tel Mardik. You don't want to go to Tel Mardik. I want to take them to Tel Mardik. You don't want to. Finally, we get away from the driver, because in those days it was a very buttoned-down place. Let's just say a buttoned-down place. And he couldn't talk in front of the driver. He said, you don't want to go there because. I said, well, why? And here's a college-educated tour guide. What's the deal? He said, we're afraid that Israel is going to attack us and take Syria because of this. They're going to say this is their land because of what's been found here, and we don't want people to go there. I said, really? Scratched my head on that one. Well, Professor Petinato no longer had the permit to work in Syria. It was revoked. Professor Mathia, who said it was not bills of sale to Sodom and Gomorrah, was still able to continue excavating in Syria until the more recent problems happened in the country. So unfortunately, sometimes politics overshadows the science of archaeology. Well, Albright saw more and more, and now Albright is considered the father of biblical archaeology, saw more and more data coming in confirming the Bible in 1936, and he says, Genesis 14 used to be considered as unhistorical, now we are more modest. He rewrote it 16 years later in 55, and he changed it to say, Genesis 14 can no longer be considered as unhistorical in view of the many confirmations of details which we owe to recent finds. The narratives of Genesis dealing with Abraham may now be integrated into the life and history of the time in such surprisingly consistent ways that there can be little doubt about their substantial historicity. We have to wonder what he would say if he lived to see the finds of Ebla, right? Wow. Well, in 1934, John Texier was looking for the lost Roman city of Tavium. He was out near Ankara, and he wandered into this town called Boghaz-Kale. And as he came into town, he saw something that stunned him. He looked out over the hills and he saw a city at least as large as Athens at the heyday of Athens. The only problem was, what city could it be? It wasn't Tavium. Tavium wasn't that big. And then he began to find these strange gates, sphinxes, gods guarding the city. What in the world was this? And then he found these with lions guarding this. What was this? A huge city larger than Athens. And a native led him over to Yazilikaya, where he was able to come into what was this pointed to as like a little sanctuary. And he came into the sanctuary, and there they found these gods that were stiffly marching across the sanctuary wall. What was this? He couldn't figure out what it was. What in the world was this? Who was this group of people? Then they found writing, this strange writing. It looked like hieroglyphs, but it wasn't hieroglyphs. And they couldn't read it. They just looked for... And then they started finding the same writing all the way out to the Aegean Sea. Hundreds and hundreds of miles, all the way down into Syria, hundreds and hundreds of miles to the south. What group of people could be this big to have their writing used throughout all of modern Turkey? He was amazed. What could it be? What could it be? It was an embarrassment because they were finding more than was known to be lost. All of Turkey, that language spread out. So in 1880, a Christian named Henry Sayce proposed that this must be the lost empire of the Hittites. People began to laugh. Scholars laughed. There were no Hittites. They're not mentioned in any Greek literature, not mentioned in any Roman literature. They never existed. It would be impossible for the Greeks and Romans not to know about them, right? And so he was laughed at. But the Bible mentioned the Hittites 48 times. One time it even said the kings of the Hittites and the kings of the Egyptians, so it had them in connection together. People should have listened, but they didn't. Then came the Rosetta Stone, and once the Rosetta Stone began to open up the ancient world of pharaonic writing, they hear Ramses the Great boasting about his conflict with the king of Haiti, the king of the Hittites. And of course, he defeated this guy, and the guy ran back to his home because he was the mighty jackal, the mighty fighter. In 1906, Winkler was digging here, and he found the first international peace treaty. You know who it was between? Ramses the Great and the king of the Hittites. Now, why would Ramses the Great, who's boasting on the walls of Karnak about how he put the Hittites to flight, make a peace treaty? The first peace treaty in the world that we have record of. Because he was susceptible to flattery. And the king of the Hittites sent Bedouin down and said, King of the Hittites heard that you were coming, and they turned tail and they ran back home. They were really afraid of you. Oh, he got puffed up, right? He goes right into the trap, and the Hittites spring the trap. He loses all of his armor. Well, he loses a lot of his soldiers and most of his armaments, and he has to go back and he makes a peace deal with the Hittites. Interesting, isn't it? And yet, people were saying they never existed. All the while, down in Karnak, we have Ramses boasting about what he had done. He was claiming to be the fearless one. He claimed to be the jackal that could traverse the whole earth. He put an end to the boastfulness of Haiti. Now we know it's just all propaganda, and yet it was believed for thousands of years. The son of Ra who trampled underfoot the land of Haiti, and yet it was not true. It was just shameless propaganda. But it was believed for over 3,000 years until we found out the truth about what was going on. So these ancient tablets and cuneiform tablets, stone cylinders, they confirm over and over these biblical stories that we've read about. The Bible has been vindicated as a reliable document. Now, there's one more mystery I want to tell you about very briefly. This one happens to be in Babylon. Babylon is very interesting. I love this. First time I saw it, it just shocked me. It's in the Istanbul Museum and also in Ankara. That's a lion with wings, eagle's wings on it. Can you see that? That's from the Ishtar Gate of Babylon. And so those of you who read prophecy, you might remember in Daniel 7, there's a lion with eagle's wings. Well, there it is. There's a symbol of Babylon. There it is. And I walked by that and I said, whoa, Daniel walked by that. How cool is that? Wonderful. Now, what's interesting about this is the Bible tells a story about how Babylon fell to the Persians. Remember the story? It talks about a guy named Belshazzar, right? Belshazzar has a great feast. Problem is, there's no record of Belshazzar in any of the Greek or Roman literature. So they said, obviously Belshazzar never existed because there's no record of him anywhere. So he couldn't have existed. So, if you want to believe that Daniel chapter 5 is correct, scholars are saying that this guy never existed, so it can't be a real story. So you're kind of in a bind, aren't you? What are you going to do? How are you going to rationalize that? How are you going to deal with that? So, time passes. We knew that there was a king, the king of Babylon, when it fell to Persia, was called Nabonidus. And they found this stone cylinder with a cuneiform writing on it, and it's a prayer for his oldest son, who's named Belshazzar. Well, Christians began to say, look at that. The Christian scholars, this is Belshazzar. And they say, oh, it can't be the same guy, Belshazzar. And besides, it doesn't call him a king, because in Daniel chapter 5, it says he's the king, Belshazzar, and that Daniel will become the third king in the kingdom. We discovered he was actually up in Babylon, in Arabia, when Babylon was captured. And then, that was the Nabonidus Chronicle in 1882, and it gives us more details. And then the Smith account in 1924 actually says that Nabonidus entrusted the kingship to his eldest son, Belshazzar. So while people were having a field day at morons that would believe the Bible is true about Daniel chapter 5, the archaeological cuneiform tablets that were found by the archaeologists actually reveal the story is true. And if that's true, it means that Daniel actually lived at that time because he's writing an accurate history of what was going on. And we'll see the implication of that in just a moment. So R.H. Pfeiffer of Harvard University, scholar there, He says, we shall presumably never know how our author learned that Belshazzar, mentioned only in the Babylonian records in Daniel and in Baruch 1:1, which is based on Daniel, was functioning as king when Cyrus took Babylon. You see, there's information in Daniel about prophecies. And the prophecies are so specific as they come down that people were saying, well, obviously he didn't live there. He's writing in prophetic prose. He's writing this from the 2nd century BC, and he's writing it in a prophetic way to make it look like a prophecy back in the 6th century, right? But the question is, how does the author know what was really going on back there? It was only in cuneiform tablets that were all forgotten about if he's living in the Roman period. The Greeks and Romans don't know about it and don't write about it. How could he know that? That's what he says here. We'll never know. So this is a mystery, but we know he couldn't be living there because then those prophecies would be true, right? So he's kind of in a bind, you might say. Again, the Bible was vindicated. It's historically accurate. And so we can have this great quote from Nabonidus in Belshazzar: of all non-Babylonian records dealing with the situation at the close of the Neo-Babylonian Empire, the 5th chapter of Daniel ranks next to cuneiform literature in accuracy so far as outstanding events are concerned. And so again, we can't prove that it's true, but we certainly have evidence that it's historically accurate, right? Historically accurate. So we can have confidence in that the Bible is historically accurate. Frederick Kenyon wrote in 1939, another great scholar, I believe he was from Yale. He said, how well are we provided with manuscripts of the Hebrew Old Testament? It is generally rather a shock when one first learns that the oldest existent manuscripts are no earlier than the 9th century after Christ. Do you get the point? Okay, here's the point. Your Old Testament goes back to the earliest manuscripts of the Old Testament in the 9th century AD, and he's saying it's more than 1,000 years from when they were actually written, right? Get what he's saying? So we don't have any original autographs, right? So he's saying it's 1,000 years, and so you just think, they're shocked when they find this out because they kind of think that we have the originals, right? Over 1,000 years separate our earliest Hebrew manuscripts from the date at which the latest of the books contained in them were originally written. Well, what's his point? Well, here it is. It's a disquieting thought when one reflects how much a text may be corrupted or mutilated in the course of transmission by manuscript over a long period of time, right? So he's saying you can't really, over 1,000 years. Just think about how much has changed. How much has it been mutilated? How much has it been corrupted as time passes on? Right? And so it's a little unsettling, isn't it? Now, remember when he wrote that? Remember when it was? 1939. Because 8 years later, Muhammad ad-Dib was looking for some lost goats down by the Dead Sea. And the story goes that he threw a rock into that cave on the screen, cave number 4, and when he threw the rock into the cave, hoping to hear his goats make their noises and find them and go round them up, he heard pottery breaking. So the story goes. And when he heard pottery breaking, the story goes that he was terrified, and he got his cousin and they ran home, and because they were afraid it was evil spirits. And then the more they thought about it, they thought it might be a pot of gold. So they got the courage to go back and look and see. And instead of finding a pot of gold, they found old pieces of leather scrolls. Remember the story? They found what's known today as the Dead Sea Scrolls. Here is a copy of the Isaiah manuscript at Qumran where they found this. Now, I said the purported story. This is a colorful character because ultimately the story goes that these Bedouin went about 8 to 10 miles across the desert to Bethlehem, and they went to Kando, who was a shoe cobbler who had a general store and who dabbled in antiquities. He bought and sold antiquities. So they took some of these leather scrolls to Kando, and so the story goes, Kando looked at them and said, well, at least I can repair shoes with them, if nothing else, right? That's how the story goes. Now, this is the grandson of Kando. He's a good friend of mine in Bethlehem. And Swigley is very interesting. He very colorful. So he said, you've heard that story about shepherd boys. And he just asked the question, he says, in your country you have cowboys. Are they children? These are not children. These were men my father was paying, my grandfather was paying to go out and look for antiquities. And they created this whole cover story to cover it up because they found these as they were going in and raiding tombs and so on to have things to sell. And so you can see that little jar to his left. There were 4 of those original jars found. 2 are in the Israel Museum, one's in the Vatican Museum, and one's in their store in Bethlehem. Kind of interesting to go and see. Wish I had that one done. That would be a nice one to have, wouldn't it? But that's their kind of treasure that their grandfathers passed on down to them. Now, the grandfather was a Syrian Christian, and they read Aramaic. They still pray in Aramaic. And it just so happens that the one piece they had brought, you know what it was? From Daniel. Because part of Daniel is written in Aramaic. He could read it. He knew it was part of the Bible. And so ultimately, this comes to the scholarly world, and we know it as the Dead Sea Scrolls today. So what was going on? Well, we wondered, who put these things there? Why are they there? Now, in my house, I've got a bunch of Bibles, I've got Bibles from all of my life. What do I do with those Bibles? Well, in the ancient world, they do the same thing. So they don't throw them away, but they had these Bibles. Well, they knew that there was a place called Qumran. It was Khirbet Qumran was a kind of a tell close by. They didn't know what it was, and so they began to excavate here. DeVoe and Harding began to excavate in around 1951 to try and see who was living here. They discovered it's a group of Essenes, and this is a very ultra Orthodox group of Jewish people who left Jerusalem, didn't believe that the Sadducees could run the temple, and they went down to live down here in isolation. They baptized themselves multiple times every day. Those stairs that you see in the picture, they're going down into a baptismal pool called a mikveh. They're going down to baptize themselves. All right, these guys are super religious, and they're living down here, no women basically, but they're living down there and they're copying the scriptures, and they're copying the Dead Sea Scrolls. And when Jerusalem falls to the Romans in AD 70, the Romans start marching down toward Masada, and these people who were living here, they take all these scrolls that they had and they go out and they hide them in a cave. And then they flee to Masada where they lose their lives. Here's the room. Looks like a dining room, but it's actually called the Scribes Room, and it's actually where they transcribed the Dead Sea Scrolls. This is a replica of what we think that they would have used, and here's where they're actually copying the scrolls. Now, they found basically sections of every book of the Bible, with the exception of Esther, every Old Testament book. Most of them were found right here in cave number 4, but there's about 11 caves, and they found scrolls in all of them that were hidden up there in the hills. And so they found that the ink on that matched the ink in the wells that they found in that little scribes room I showed you a moment ago. So we know that this is where they were made and where they were copied and where they were hidden. Now, they found the entire book of Isaiah. Miller Burroughs was the secretary of the the Oriental School he was the secretary of the American School of Oriental Research in Jerusalem, and he publishes the first book on the Dead Sea Scrolls. This is from his book. This is Miller Burroughs. Some readers may be disappointed that the translations of the Isaiah manuscript, now they found the whole book of Isaiah, right? Remember, Frederick Kenyon's question is, how much has it changed in 1,000 years, right? Now we have something that goes back 1,000 years before, right? This is now 200 BC, 1,000 years later, 900, all right? So we've got 1,000 years going on. Some readers may be disappointed that the translations of the Isaiah manuscript are not included in this edition of the text of the Dead Sea Scrolls. The fact is that most of the differences between these manuscripts and the traditional Hebrew text do not involve changes of meaning that would be evident in a translation. What? And the differences that do involve such changes are not sufficiently frequent to justify the space for the translations of these texts. What's he saying? He's saying when you translate it into English, you're not going to see the difference. And how much time has passed? Over 1,000 years. Now, we still don't have the originals. We don't have the original Isaiah. But we can see that over 1,000 years, it hadn't been changed and mutilated and corrupted like Frederick Kenyon tried to get us to imagine it had. It's been preserved. So tonight, we've looked at fabulous stories. The archaeological site tells us. We've gone from Petra to Iraq. We've gone from Iraq to Turkey. We've gone from Turkey now to the Dead Sea. And we see the same story over and over again, that the biblical story is historically accurate and true. The spade of the archaeologist confirms the Bible so that we can have confidence in it. God has preserved His Word, the Bible. Now, I'd like to think about this text. I want to leave it with you tonight. Isaiah chapter 40, verse 8. The grass withereth, the flower fadeth, but the word of our God shall stand forever. Beautiful text, isn't it? Reminds me of that Quaker poet, John Greenleaf Whittier, who wrote, "We search the world for good truth. We call the good, the pure, the beautiful. From graven stone and written scroll, in all the old flower fields of the soul. And weary seeker of the best, we come back laden from our quest to find that all the sages said is in the book our mothers read." Let's pray together. Father in heaven, thank you tonight for this opportunity we've had to make a journey to wonderful places, see these beautiful things of Petra and these other interesting sites. Thank you for the opportunity to be here tonight and share with this group of people. And I pray that our confidence in the book, the Bible, the Scriptures, might have been increased as a result of being here. I pray that you'll bless each of us as we try and hear you speak to our hearts as we read its pages. Speak to our hearts, and may we see you revealed in a clearer, more beautiful way each and every day. Is my prayer in the name of Jesus. Amen.